Hi, welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the UpNorth Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel. My co-host is Anthony Weber. He's unable to be with us in the studio today. Our topic is economic inequality in America. I have three guests with me this evening. Mike Walton is with us. He is an AmeriCorps VISTA here at the UpNorth Media Center. He produces documentary pieces on economic and poverty-related topics like food insecurity and assistance programs. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks.
Next to him is Amy Shamroe. She is the Public Policy Chair for the American Association of University Women. There is a chapter right here in Traverse City.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And also Brandon Everest. He is a professor of sociology over at NMC. He also is a state licensed social worker, having worked in that field for 15 years here in Northern Michigan. He's also the steering committee member and chair at the Research and Measurement Committee of the Traverse Bay Poverty Reduction Initiative. That's a mouthful. That's right. And a member of the American Sociological Association, sections on poverty, mobility, and inequality in teaching and learning. You're a busy guy.
That's a mouthful, yes. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and for bringing your expertise. So, Mike, if I could, you've been working with these issues pretty directly with the public here in the area. Could you just give us kind of a starting point? What is going on in America with inequality, with the income wealth gap? Where are we? Kind of what's been happening?
Sure. Well, you kind of have to go back a while. We started seeing the income inequality in America increase around the 70s, and it's been going up ever since. And the most common theories that I've heard as to why that's happening, and that I agree with, are globalization and technology are the big overriding influences. Basically, it affects people in a number of ways, but things are a lot more efficient. So, it's kind of increased profits. For the very people at the very top who can really make use of that efficiency, and other wages at the middle class have stagnated pretty much that entire time. And when you consider inflation and rising cost of living, that puts a real strain on most families in America.
Yeah, over 90% of the returns of the boom in the 90s went to the top 1%, and that number has basically stayed the same in the post-recessionary recovery as well. Other factors that really contribute here too are returns to education, as it's known. In this globalizing economy, it's also being driven by technological change. The jobs that pay the most require a considerable amount of education to get. We've turned away from a manufacturing kind of an economy, deindustrializing into a service economy. And really, those kinds of middle and upper middle class jobs and beyond in the service economy are a really small number. The vast majority of those service sector jobs are service delivery kinds of jobs that don't require a lot of skills necessarily or a lot of education. And so we see all the time graphs that show that if you get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree and beyond, that the returns to education are at an all-time high and probably rising as things continue to go forward. So it is about pay and distribution, but it's also about things like education mixed in there too that are driving some of these forces.
Is that related to, you mentioned the 1%. And I've looked at charts. The 1% seems to be like up to the moon, when you look at a graph. But if you talk about the 3% are people we all know that are making that level income. So that seems like a really drastic difference in wealth, if you will. Yeah. People that we know every day that we interact with that are in the 3% income range, if I'm saying that properly, right?
Yeah, sure.
So the gap is really right there almost, isn't it?
Oh, it sure is. When we talk about the 1%, it's an attempt to try to signify that there's a segment of the population that really lives materially different lives than the rest of us, but it also shrouds the fact that if we were to look at tenths of percents in that 1%, We're talking about a massive rise in annual income and wealth when we get into the 0.5% and the 1/10 of 1% going on even more. Tremendous wealth. We're talking about major differences in the material lives that people live between even a person who is at the 1% line and a person who's, say, at the 1/10% line. Major difference in terms of how that experience is lived out with what you can have and what you can enjoy from that labor.
Yeah, and when you can say 1%, 3%, 10%. The real reason this is an issue isn't that the people at the top are making so much more money. It's that the people at the bottom are losing the opportunity to move up in the sort of like increase their standard of living, move up through pay, and become the 1% pretty much.
So you're saying that's directly related to the gap, why the gap is widening. Is that what you mean?
I would say so.
Yeah.
I don't know what you guys think.
Right.
I think that really matters. I also just think too that when we look at the sorts of jobs that have returned in the recessionary recovery, they're not middle-income jobs. Jobs that are coming back are low-wage, low-income jobs, and also those upper middle class and upper class jobs that I was just talking about that have given considerable returns to people with education. When you look at it, not to bore the heck out of people with statistics, but when we look at the income distribution, we try to divide the income distribution into 5 parts, into what are called quintile groups. Where we're seeing the greatest rise in the numbers of people are at the lower and the upper ends. In fact, we're producing more millionaires and billionaires now than we ever have before. But conversely, as the middle class is shrinking, a lot of those folks are experiencing downward mobility and are ending up in the bottom 40%. So that we've got a number of people, the greatest number of people, about 50% of Americans are in the bottom 40% of the income distribution.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, if I'm understanding, I've heard the word income and wealth, and they're 2 different things. So it sounds like the inequality is really coming from how we measure income. We're always going to have wealthy people, right? We're always going to have people who, there's different ways to make money. People make money, money makes money. So we're always going to have those really wealthy people making mailbox money. So is it really income equality that we're talking about across the board when we talk about this huge gap that's been widening over these years?
No, not at all. The term income inequality, I always felt is a bit misleading because it implies an ideal situation would be total income equality in which everyone makes the same, which is not ideal or practical in a capitalistic society. We just should be saying extreme income inequality because a little bit is healthy. A lot can stagnate economic growth overall.
Okay, and I think Amy would probably.
Yeah, well, part of this, and it's a very minute piece. I shouldn't say minute. It's a smaller piece of this larger puzzle that we're talking about. But if you look at national statistics, women are the bread earners in the majority of families now. They are the more educated. They tend to be the more educated, or at least the higher ranking in business and the professions. They're also paid nationally on average 77 cents on the dollar. So even when we're talking about these larger issues of people not being able to move upwardly, as we're looking at the people who are actually in there earning this income, they're getting paid. The women who are the major workers in the families are also getting paid less, which is also stifling the family, which in turn stifles growth, economic growth. Women are also the major purchasers and buyers across the board nationally, but especially in families, it's been shown. So by giving them less money, they're spending less, they're supporting the economy less because they're trying to make it all work tighter. And so this all contributes to kind of this larger picture we're talking about. But on a smaller level, it's really important to not forget that there are these inequalities. When you go to women of color, talking again about the social backgrounds and the higher hurdles they have to climb, that becomes an even smaller number. It's about 65 to 67, depending on who you're talking about on the dollar compared to men. So again, we're talking about, we live in this country where you're supposed to be able to move upward if you just work hard enough and you educate yourself and you do all these other factors that are supposed to contribute to allowing you to move up the ladder, allowing you to become a larger economic player. And yet there are these inherent system flaws that are keeping it from happening on every level.
I think, we want to maybe talk about solutions. I want to talk about solutions, but before we do, I've been kind of curious about the devaluing of human resources. Is that part of this at all? And obviously when we talk about women, it is in essence a devaluing of women versus men. But just in general, we've talked about globalization, we've talked about the technology and these other things, but is there something going on where just in companies we're not valuing the human resource as much for some reason? Have you seen that at all?
I'm not sure if I would put it that way. I think, yes, in a certain way, the processes are devaluing human labor. One of the aspects of globalization that really drives down wages for American workers is that the flattening of the world, so to speak, puts American workers on a toe-to-toe competitive level with workers from around the world, whether they're men or women or other, et cetera. And that's going to allow capital investments to fly to the places where the wages are the most competitive, essentially putting a downward wage pressure for the world round. I think that is probably more important than maybe a more humanistic devaluation, like an attitudes issue. I think that matters too, most definitely, but I think a lot of this does boil down to economics in a big way.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's comforting to try to find someone to blame, and in some cases there are some parts of this situation, but in a lot of cases it's overall trends, and just not enough has been done to counter that kind of thing. And it's not like an intentional, rich guy with a monocle saying, "I'm going to pay my workers next to nothing." Right. Not always in that situation. It's just trying to stay competitive.
That said, though, I think that I'm coming from a background of looking at women's pay specifically, but I think if you look at it as a whole, there was Equal Pay Day was about a week ago on April 14th, and that there were some comics kind of going around and tongue-in-cheek political humor, but women make this much less. How many open positions do we have now? That's kind of to fill with women because they get paid less. But I do think that there is a bit of that play. You saw that when you talked earlier about the economic collapse and the rebuilding from it, that a lot of the middle management positions went away. And when they did start hiring again, you find they didn't hire the middle managers who were making the higher dollar before. Right. They hired the newer, younger people, or people that they thought they could get at a value. So that's not something you can legislate, but at the same time, that comes into play also with how we're looking at this development and how we're proceeding in this globalized economy.
Ultimately, I do think there is an attitudinal part of it that I don't know how easily we can talk about it, but ultimately when people in the positions to pay others, when they have that power, their value sets are going to guide the distribution of the wealth that's generated inside of a business. So I don't think that we can say that attitude doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. There is a general sense, right, with globalization, really from NAFTA on, especially with free trade agreements, where we've created a very permissive environment for capital to be able to flow to where the cheapest wages are, and that had to have been accompanied by value systems that employers and capital owners have, and ultimately I do think there is a piece of it. I think maybe if we move towards some sense that there's a floor maybe beneath which Americans shouldn't be able to fall, maybe we could to get to that, but I think that there is an attitudinal piece, but I think a lot of it is that we've sort of legislated and allowed the economics to go to a way where profit maximization, which is the primary value of business owners, has sort of been set free to do its work. And of course the collateral damage shows up in economic inequality, mm-hmm. which I don't think is limited to income. It's also about wealth. We'll always have wealthy people, but the distribution of wealth is not unrelated to the distribution of income. And I think that it's good to talk about both, really, as economic inequality, not just income inequality.
How much faith do you have that capitalism will take care of it? When we just had in the news last week out in Seattle, a gentleman, Dan Price, I don't have the name of his business, he reduced his own salary enough so that the lowest paid person in his entire company is paid $70,000 a year. I think that's what he put his down to. And I have to wonder if, yes, that might be just the right thing to do, but if by doing that he's trying to attract really great employees that are going to be loyal. Turnover is very expensive in a business of employees. And so, I mean, nobody relies on a retirement anymore, but part of that is turnover. That's, you know, the employee's decision. Moving around a lot is much more common nowadays. So do you think that capitalism will take care of it in that respect, that employers are now saying, wait a minute, it costs me a lot of money. I want to keep these people. Maybe I should figure out a way to pay them more. Or do you think that we're going to go too far, the pendulum's going to swing too far this way before that can kind of balance out and kind of save our situation? What do you think?
I think that there are internal forces at work that could work that way, and I think it really comes down to demand side economics to some extent. I mean, Mike was referring earlier to the fact that there's a point at which if we don't have a robust middle class who can consume, and 2/3 to 3/4 of the economy is driven by consumption, then there are going to be changes. You know, the CEO of General Electric was just talking in the last few years about how we need to raise the amount of manufacturing that exists inside the country to drive a higher consumption. So I think there might be some internal mechanisms within capitalism that will help. But I think going back to this question of attitudes and value systems, a lot of the questions that we're raising are beyond just economic. They're moral questions. It's really about ethics, about notions of fairness, and senses about what equality means and exactly how that will manifest itself within our country and around the world. I think we've got to be looking at it as both. Capitalism may be able to, it's very flexible by its nature. It's innovative, I think, also as a structural system. But if attitudes are such that it's okay that for the first time the Forbes 400 list, in order to even get on the list you had to be a billionaire, as long as we say that that's okay. As long as we say that there is no floor underneath which or through which Americans can fall, as long as we keep those attitudes, then I think that we will go very far before those economic mechanisms kick in to correct the situation.
Well, and I would agree with that to a point, but you know, right now I think we're at an interesting time too, though, because we do have, if you look at pay and the financial world, we're talking like high Wall Street players. You look at the pay in the high IT, like Google and some of those, you find that pay equality and overall pay for cost of living and everything is really puts them in the higher stratosphere of income, because again, they don't want that turnover, but that's a highly specialized force. The same time, in the same exact cities, you have protests going on for raising the minimum wage at fast food workers. So there you have the two examples, one where capitalism is taking care of itself by protecting its resources, by protecting the valued assets, and then the other where it's coming from more social pressure. So while I agree that we live, you know, America takes much pride in being a capitalist society, and we are kind of at a point of hyper-capitalism right now, there is a bit of that creeping in, that hyper-capitalist awareness creeping into the consciousness of the people that ultimately can be a driver of force. So we can talk about capitalism correcting itself by itself, but that capitalism doesn't exist in a vacuum. We all participate in it.
Yeah,
so that's where some of that comes from.
Absolutely, I agree 100% with that. Humans inhabit social structures. We do it. You know, we're guided by these principles, the larger forces, no doubt. But I mean, ultimately, yes, I think there's a growing awareness. I mean, we see it across the political spectrum. Economic inequality is on the agenda of Republicans and Democrats alike, and certainly of conservatives and progressives beyond them. And I think there is a growing awareness. But I don't personally believe in a kind of inevitabilistic thing that a certain number of people protesting will necessarily result in some kind of change. We can look around the world and see that there are plenty of disaffected, disenfranchised people marching in the streets, and their totalitarian dictators continue to rule them just fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't even need to, I don't even think you need to go to a totalitarian place to see that.
Yeah.
Look at the Occupy movement. I don't think that really made very much difference in terms of policy, but there were a lot of people marching, a lot of people mad.
Yeah. It did do one good thing, and that put economic inequality on the map.
That's
Exactly.
true. That's true.
That was the thing, I think, that was the biggest result of Occupy.
Probably baby steps, maybe.
Yeah,
Yes.
There you go.
definitely.
So it sounds like, if I'm understanding the way you're describing it, that almost in these last 20, 30 years, that where we're going as far as the social structure of capitalism, it's almost like the middle class, a huge chunk of them have been raised up a little bit, but a lot are falling back down through the cracks, whether it's because of education, that kind of thing. And so it's almost become more top heavy. Am I maybe getting this right a little bit? And that's what's kind of causing the stretch. Not really this extreme wealth. You said there's more millionaires in that, but almost like this section that can't cut it, if you will, for a lack of a better way to say it, but or whatever. And so what we're looking at, what we're really talking about is really our perception of poverty, right? If we just look at that side of things for a moment. Is it, when it comes down to ethics, that kind of thing, do we need to talk about what it means to be in poverty? Is that what's really going on here?
I think so. I think that's an important conversation to have, and I think there's a lot of in America, we're a very individualistic society. We like a person who is working hard and lifts themselves up, and I feel like sometimes people think like I worked hard to get where we have this. There's this common saying that like anyone in America, if they work hard enough, you can make it. And I think people look at that and maybe they're successful, but they think the inverse of that, which is if you haven't made it, you must not be working hard enough.
Yeah. Exactly. You're just lazy or
right. That's the automatic. I feel like that's the automatic response for a lot of people, and it's simply not true.
They don't know what poverty is. They've never seen.
Absolutely.
What it's like in this third world country. We don't really have real poverty in America, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that's another thing. Well, first of all, people in poverty are some of the hardest working people I've ever met. Right. And poverty looks different in America, partly because a lot of people work very hard to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree.
And that's so you might not know the person, your classmate is in poverty or your coworker is in poverty. So
because it's more shameful here.
It's shameful. It goes back to the thing. If you haven't made it, you must be lazy. You must not. You must be irresponsible. You must not be working hard. So I think we need to kind of get over that attitude.
And I think we like to put different labels on it. The people that we do see in poverty, whether it's personally in class with us or that we can just see as it falls, in a large city, the people in poverty are in the ghetto. So there's this inherent term that you put on them that makes it sound, that kind of has an implication in American society that you're not working then. The ghetto is just poor and it's people not trying. It's rednecks. Right. It's, we have different terms in different parts of the country and different groups of people that we like to label them with, all that give, I think, work, at least under the surface, if people aren't aware of it, and some people might be clearly aware of it, that those terms all allow everybody who's not in that position to sidestep it without actually addressing it as a problem. It's easy to put that label on people and walk away and make the jokes and do whatever else you want about it. But the truth of the matter is that those are the face of poverty in America. Appalachia is the face of poverty. Harlem can be the face of poverty. That's the reality.
And let's face it, it's all full of stereotype images. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we talk about poverty, we're sort of masking the fact that really we should be talking about poverties. Because many people are in the situation of poverty for many different reasons. Rural communities, there are more people in poverty in rural communities than in city centers. So when we think about, poverty as sort of being primarily an urban problem or primarily a problem of non-whites, we're masking things when we do that. We're masking it when we talk about poverty by the fact that many people will fall in and out of, fall below the federal poverty threshold, right? 2/3 of us in the course of our lifetime in our adult life will fall beneath the poverty line. There's a tremendous amount of cycling in and out that takes place. But typically when we talk about poverty, we think in generational terms. We have this image of folks whose value systems are different, and by that we think that the middle class is the default then too. So there's a lot it's about the stories that we tell, and it's really about promoting a sense that either the people at the top or the people at the bottom are somehow inherently different than the rest of the middle class. And in that, we sort of justify the positions of where those folks end up by attributing those so much power to the differences, when I would argue that they're really not there. Those are ways that we justify the existence
kind
of
of
it.
to just put a face to it?
Sure.
You know, I was recently in Chicago for a weekend, and we see panhandlers right on the street.
Yeah, sure.
And so many people that just walk by, they don't even see them as human. They're just there. They're part of the landscape, almost. And
Yeah.
and kind of what you're saying, that it's almost like we can't put ourselves in their shoes, like, well, I would never end up in that position.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
What did that person do to end up in that position?
Yeah, sure.
So
sure, absolutely.
it feels,
And we do that with folks at the top too, when we attribute, great strength of character and moral will and of hard work and things like that. That's also untrue. For some people, they worked hard and got where they got, and for others, it was utterly handed to them.
Right.
And to talk about any of these classes too generally, we're going to necessarily use stereotypes to do that. And I think that those stereotypes just reinforce the situation that we're in. If we don't try to deal with individuals and the skills and the assets that they have and see this as a human problem, if 80% of us, another statistic for you, 80% of us through the course of our lifetime will become economically insecure that we would qualify for various kinds of social welfare. This is not an us-them thing, this is a human problem.
right.
And I think that when we talk about it in other ways, we mask that.
So I have a question about that, since you're a sociology professor, and I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but I'm dying to know the answer. Maybe you can make it very brief. I've always thought about our modern society is really an artificial construct, right? So we're so far removed from the natural world and a natural order, if you will, where we could get food, water, our very basic needs from nature, and that we went from hunter-gatherers to this agricultural society. But our modern society almost is artificial, and we've created poverty, in my mind. And I'm hoping you can speak to this a little bit, in that if food is basically within the realm of corporations and they can charge X amount of money for it, and if most of society can afford it at a certain rate, there's always going to be those on the bottom, and can they even afford something like food? Do you see where I'm going with this? I just wonder if you have any comment about that concept of how we've created society in this kind of artificial construct.
Well, I think that's...
Which creates poverty.
Yeah, I think that's all very important stuff to talk about. I think any society, regardless of its social organization, there's going to be a percentage of people who will be, maybe by their nature, dependent. And people who maybe have organic dysfunctions of the brain, cognitive disorders, disabilities, severe mental illness. I don't think, whether it's capitalism or socialism or communism or anything else, there's going to be a segment of folks who will be in a position to need help. But the thing is all the rest of it then is a social construction. This is about the distribution of the wealth that's generated in the economy, and these are the results of values, legislation, and political relationships. These are choices, but also the result of logics of social institutions and of the economy in general. So I would agree wholeheartedly that these are problems of social construction, not of individuals. Social class is experienced by individuals, but it's a characteristic of society.
So let's talk solutions.
All right.
How do we solve these problems?
Oh boy.
They seem
we go.
pretty big, pretty vast,
Yeah.
pretty overwhelming
Yeah,
problems in a society's
Well,
a very complicated thing.
sure it is.
I don't know, but I can tell you right away, it's not going to be a magic bullet situation. It's going to have to be a multi-prong attack.
Yeah.
What are some of the prongs?
Well, I think education is a big part of it. Education has been public funding for education has been cut a lot in recent years, but that's an extremely important part of it. But it's also not the only part of it, because just as an example, women are consistently do better in school. They're consistently overrepresented in colleges, and yet they're making less money. So it's not the only solution, you know.
They're underrepresented in a lot of places
Yes.
like Congress and
there
all
you
the
go.
political positions, CEOs, heads of companies, all of
Absolutely,
that as well.
absolutely.
And I'll piggyback on that then because, from this more small lens or focus lens, I guess I would say, that we're looking through for, women's equality and pay, which again just factors in through everything that we're talking about here. In 1963, Kennedy passed the Equal Pay Act, and that was leaps and bounds ahead of where we had been this whole, history of women in America. However, it was all in words and not a lot in action. There were no teeth to it. You could say we are not allowed to pay women differently, but how are you going to prove that? There's still to this day, as in most states, it's illegal for you. It can be if your employer chooses to, they can allow you, but most choose not to. But you can't just go and ask to see the pay of the people in your whole company, let alone your department, to know how you're stacking up against people. And you can be fired for it without cause in any state.
Just for asking what other people are
just for
paid?
asking, yep.
Oh.
If that's a corporate policy, they can fire you, and there's nothing you can do for recourse. A couple of years ago, the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act was signed into law by President Obama. That allowed, Lilly Ledbetter worked for Goodyear, and she found out after, I think it was about 17 years working there, she was getting paid significantly less than her male coworkers. So she sued to make up for the lost wages. Well, the only law on the books at the time federally was that you had to know within 180 days of the first unequal paycheck and report within that time period. Otherwise, you couldn't make the claim. So she ended up never actually being able to file a claim and win, but what the act now allows is that if you do find out through whatever means, you can at any point get those lost wages back and work for correction on it. That said, though, there's still a long ways to go. You can't compare. There's not a lot of recourse. There's nothing out there for recourse if you can compare. So doing something like that allows for not over legislating, like you're saying. That's not a magic bullet. It's not going to fix everything. But knowing that there's things like that out there for a woman to try and equal out the pay scale, that then helps, again, like we talked about, that helps the families, that helps the economy that they contribute to, that helps everything else by making sure that the earning is equal and that the major major consumer in the economy is able to fully participate.
So I was just watching the show Madman.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you've seen this. For the first time, just last night, coincidentally.
Oh.
And I watched the first couple episodes, and I thought, I don't know if I could stomach this. With the way the women were treated in this office. It's in a ad office in the 60s.
I've seen it.
But what struck me even more than that was the women's attitudes. That, obviously this was the culture of the day, and when you're in that position of submission, basically, it's in the woman's mind as well. So in watching that whole show and thinking about our conversation today, I'm thinking that's a much bigger hurdle than passing a law that says equal pay, is the mindsets of everyone involved, right? And women saying, I deserve this equal pay.
Well, that's something that they have gone into, actually. There's been a lot of studies done in the last couple of years about this, and one of the things they have found is that the myth, or the idea that women don't ask for raises is actually a myth. The problem that they found when they go through at corporate levels is that the bosses are just more inclined to just give men raises. Women have to go ask for them. And then there is kind of that fear of perception of being considered bossy or out of line for that.
Yeah.
They find that it usually results in a raise, but not to what the men are naturally given. And then when they follow those quizzes or those surveys up with the people actually making these decisions and ask them why, there's really no answer. It's an inherent part of the culture and this kind of just perception. And so that's really, it's not just about the law, but at the same time, it's laws and things like that are raising the issues that make people second guess it. Why am I overlooking this person that did just as much work? Is it because they don't sit there and tell everybody how much work they did? Or is it, just because it's part of our inherent culture? So
I do think, though, it's not conclusive, this question about how women advocate in the workplace. There is some interpretation here. I mean, one thing we can say for sure is that the work world, especially as it's shown in Madman, but it's based on something real, that these are patriarchal institutions that are men's worlds. And I think it seems very reasonable, and we have evidence too to show that women's socialization is different. Self-advocacy is done in a different way. And I think that is going to drive some of what takes place in the sphere of work. If men are able to have the latitude to be more assertive, if not aggressive, and have it be seen as leadership, and women are put in a situation where that could be seen as being the big B word, then that means that I would assume that there are going to be behavioral impacts on women's behavior in the situation. They're going to be careful in different ways, I would think. And we do have some evidence for that. It's questionable. At the same time, I would be really hesitant to put too much emphasis on that, because then that puts on women the problems for the problems of the economy when it comes to the pay gap, when it is also about the values of employers and supervisors who are in the position to give merit raises and promotions and such.
I was reading today about the family unit when we're talking about income or wealth, and the power of the family unit, especially if both a man and a woman, or whatever the family might be, but two people in that family are both working, as opposed to if one is, the other isn't, or stay-at-home mom, that kind of thing, and how we look at wealth and income and the gap as we measure it by family units. And so I'm wondering how that ties into this discussion and the perception of women from a whole different angle, and that is the idea of women being homemakers. I'm trying to spit out here what I mean. I'm thinking of Phyllis Schlafly. Yes. I'm trying to get to her. And this idea of a whole host of women who want to lead a movement, if you will, or stop the feminist movement, if you will, because their value system is so different and want to impose it on everybody else, it would seem. But can you talk about that a little bit? I'm really mashing it here. Help me out.
Well, we're stumbling on each other. Well, I think that, to start out, we'll start on kind of a more hopeful note. If you look at millennials and they're polling them about their perceptions, there isn't a perception that women are supposed to leave the office, when to start having children. However, there's also the perception that if you choose to, that's a fine choice, which I think has always been a goal of feminists of various stripes. Definitely. And so looking forward, that is something that's been removed from perception at this point. That said, not everybody's millennials that are out there voting and are out there participating in the economy. And so there is this perception, I've talked about equal pay day and equal pay in different forums. And the question that always arises is, well, women take time off to have families, or women, they leave the workforce and they have to worry about that happening. And yeah, that's a factor. And when you look at equal pay numbers, though, most of the time that's factored in. It's not factored equal years on the job. It's exact experience, it's exact time on the job, not with gap years.
Time off too.
Yeah, and not with gap years. And you look at that where, then you look over to this, a famous example that everybody likes to point to, the Scandinavian countries, where a lot of time, men's time off as part of childbirth is actually factored in. And so it's not, there is this wanting to have that accepted, and as we're seeing, looking to the younger generations, there is this acceptance that you have the option, either option is fine. But what I think needs to grow is not just that either option is fine for women, that either option can be fine for men. I know men that stay home and work because their job allows them to, and they stay home with their child more often. We do have that advantage of the digital workplace now that allows for telecommuting a lot.
Absolutely.
But it's getting kind of all of that accepted and on page, and getting the Phyllis Schlafly's, well, she's probably never going to change, but getting
90, so.
Getting the and I'm just going to use this term for lack of a better term, getting the more conservative element of people to realize that that's not a threat to the family unit, and quite frankly, sometimes it's essential to the family unit that both parents are working, and it still allows for a family to thrive.
Well, the wage structure has demanded that most two-parent-headed family households work. The dual worker family is by far the most common today, and it wasn't because of bra-burning feminists clamoring for greater work rights. It was because of economic drive primarily, and the necessity that was given by that. I think that all of this is very important. But continuing on to this idea of of solutions, you know, I think that there are one-on-one things that we can do. In the work that the Area Poverty Reduction Initiative is engaged in, we've found a great deal of success in mentoring and network building as a way to be able to help folks out. You know, we can talk about plenty of other legislative ideas. I think that we probably all have ideas about that, but I think that this is an interesting opportunity. One of the things that we know drives a lot of misunderstanding and probably a lot of social problems is the extent to which we've segregated ourselves in the society. That the Pew Research Center just put out a big study called The Big Sort that looked at all these different ways that people are moving to different areas of the world, and or of the country, I should say, or even within their own communities, segmenting themselves off, segregating themselves off with people who are like them. Mm-hmm. What that ends up and does is it creates a lot of misunderstanding. For one, that means that a person toward the bottom end of the income distribution is never going to have a chance to interact with people toward the top. We're going to live very exclusive lives in that way. So the other byproduct of it is that a lot of low-income folks don't have a Rolodex that's worth a darn. Mm-hmm. They don't have connections. And what do we say about getting a job? It's who you know. Mm-hmm. If that's true, and there's a lot of evidence to support it, then it seems like mentoring and network sharing begins to strike at that. So if I can get to know somebody and, you know, a person's looking for a job, I've been fortunate enough to make a lot of connections in our community. If I know this person and it's somebody that I can vouch for, I want to help them find a better job. In fact, I feel like I should. I feel duty-bound to do that. But I think that that's something that could be really helpful, is just if we can begin to open up social networks a little bit more to break down the kind of housing and lifestyle segregation that we've created that divides us from each other, that might begin to make a difference. And you know, especially for folks who are generationally in a low-income situation, a lot of what goes into getting jobs is really knowing the code of middle-class communication, how to present yourself, how to speak, what to say, what not to say. Not everybody was socialized to understand those skill sets. They maybe just don't have them, or have various attitudes about that. If we can begin to interact with each other in this way, I think that a lot could happen just in the face-to-face sphere to help bolster the skills of folks who are maybe in a generationally or a longer-term difficult income situation, and begin to open up social networks to break some of those things down, to give greater opportunities to people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, showstopper there.
No, I mean,
We're pondering.
It's an interesting
pondering.
point, because we look at how, if anybody were to look at our society right now, I think you'd say that we are the most socially connected we've ever been through social media and internet, and you know, we're able to keep up on international events with just the click of a button. But as you're saying, through those mediums, it's so much easier to segregate yourselves from other people, of other backgrounds, of other opinions, and you know, that's an excellent point, that raising that point.
Yeah, and I mean, and not to downplay mentoring or anything, I think it's extremely important. But part of me is thinking, like, it's great, but it shouldn't be necessary, you know? Like, it should be happening naturally in the environment we've created, but it's not happening.
Right, because of the environment we've created.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I mean, this is really to address the situation as it is,
Right.
You know.
Because
Ideally,
we
I would
naturally segregate, don't we? I mean, that is human nature. If we look at anthropology, the whole history, evolutionarily, that's been needed, you know, to separate us from them when we, you know, for survival. That's something that's almost ingrained genetically, right? We have a tendency to do that.
Maybe.
I definitely think it's a tendency. And I've heard it. A friend of mine thinks it's a very American trait as well to want to put everything in its own little box, and like, or make everything like this or that. You know, it's like it's good or bad. It's Republican or Democrat. It's whatever.
Yeah.
If people, you know, this is to some extent about, you know, the liberty to make the kind of choices about who and how you want to live, and those kinds of choices, and I think that to a large extent that's somewhat inviolable, but the consequences of how we divide ourselves and differentiate ourselves, those things we create, and those things are really also about values. You know, it's one thing to say, like, I'm different than this person, or I'm different from that person, or my group is different than that group, but the consequences of those things, those come down to human values and the extent to which we can embrace the other, quote unquote, as someone who at least deserves a basic level of dignity and respect. If we can't get to that point, then pretty much everything that we're talking about is a moot point, I think.
So for each of you, as we're kind of rounding out here and running out of time, I'll give an opportunity for each one of you to answer this question. So when we think about inequality, which is how we labeled the show, economic inequality, is there a difference between equality and fairness? And I know, Mike, you started earlier, you said something about, you know, we can't really gauge pay because, you know, pay against pay, because jobs are not always equal, if you will. I think you touched on that a little bit. But this idea of equality versus fairness, do you want to just comment on that? Maybe each of you have kind of a last word, if you will, out the...
Sure, and yeah, what I said was there's, you know, in a capitalistic society like we have, there's always going to be jobs that pay more than other jobs. Part of it's so people have something to shoot for, like to work up to, and maybe what you mean by this, and I don't know, but I do think there's a difference, and maybe one of the examples is how much less of a percentile the very wealthy spend on taxes. Because if you look at America in compared to other developed nations, I saw this chart where it compares us in terms of inequality, and before taxes we're not that bad. But after taxes, we are by far the worst, by far. Yeah. So maybe that's what you mean. I don't know, but
I mean whatever you want.
Okay.
Well, I think it's actually, you know, one of the tenets of this discussion from the standpoint of, you know, us at American Association of University Women and other people fighting for equal pay is not just equal pay, but equal pay for equal work. And I think that actually is across the board. I mean, yes, we speak about it in the terms of women getting paid the same as their male counterparts, but I think it's the same across the board. Nobody's saying that a secretary who shows up to work, be it male or female, should be making as much as the executive they work for. They're making different decisions, they're making different choices, they're doing different jobs. But the question is then, when you look at like an engineer who's getting hired out of college, let's say take 2 engineers from 2 Ivy League colleges, same GPA and everything. Studies have shown, there's a new one by AAW called Graduating to a Pay Gap, women are still getting paid 18% less than that man. And like we've talked about here though, if you start scratching below the surface, there's also, you know, there's the difference for women of color. There's a difference for anyone of color versus, you know, a white male. So it's, some of the stuff is just looking at how we're treating it. It's what we've kind of said. It's changing our abilities to negotiate, stand up for ourselves, make ourselves a force. And by ourselves, I'm speaking of women, but of everyone, of making ourselves an asset and not just taking what's available and offered because it's of the tough economic times. It's harder to do because a lot of us aren't in that position, but doing what we can where there's wiggle room. And it's also a matter of changing the perception. You know, you look at the difference in pay of executives versus employees from the 50s to today. There's a huge gap, and not nearly enough has changed socially in America to reflect that large percentage change, to have it up to 500% difference now. That also has to come from, as we've addressed, differences in the mindset of the employers as well. So, you know, it's just working on raising this awareness and trying to find, kind of almost like the networking example, trying to find the common ground to have the discussion, so it's not the difference of, you know, the perception of the monocled fat cat, as we were talking about with the cigar, versus the, you know, occupier down in the streets protesting and sitting around without a job and doing nothing, you know. So there's these two completely different perceptions, and somewhere in between there has to be a common ground to start talking about how we got to this point and how we come back. So
Absolutely.
Brandon, fairness versus equality.
I think they are separate questions, and Americans have an attitude toward equality that is more about the equality of opportunity than the equality of outcomes or of conditions. The fact is that we have neither, though. we have neither equality of opportunities nor do we have equality of conditions. So I think that that's a starting place. But Americans also balk, really, when it comes down to equality. Because in our modern sense of it, there's an implication of sameness, that we're going to get the same thing regardless of other factors. And Americans sort of balk, want to move away from that. I think a conversation that would be generative and move us forward is really to begin to differentiate between equality and equity. If we focus on equity, we get into principles of access to resources. You know, so if we have an equitable education resource, for example, that we actually say that it doesn't matter if you live in a poor neighborhood, that is not going to be factored in how we fund public schools, then we can begin to improve both equality of opportunity and potentially equality of condition in the end result. The focus should be on equity and access more than on equality if our goal is to get closer to equality.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Mike, for being with me this evening here at In Focus, and thank you at home for watching.